Yesterday, the world was told the Strait of Hormuz was open again. Trump posted, "Thank you," in capital letters. Oil dropped. Markets lifted. Television anchors did what television anchors always do when they smell relief. They rushed to frame the moment as closure, a breakthrough, a turn, a signal that the war was finally bending toward an ending. Then this morning, Iran took it back. The Revolutionary Guards announced that control of Hormuz had returned to what they called its previous state strict management. Armed oversight the waterway back under military control. Within hours, ships that had started moving toward the strait began turning around inside the Gulf. One tanker stopped broadcasting its position. Others slowed, hesitated, or vanished into the usual haze of maritime ambiguity that always appears when fear returns faster than paperwork can keep up. And the word Tehran chose mattered even more than the maneuver. Iran did not describe the American blockade as pressure. It did not describe it as deterrence. It did not even describe it first as war. It called it piracy, maritime robbery. That was the language. Hold on to that. Because the real story is not that Hormuz looked open yesterday and looked controlled again today. The real story is that a 10-year structure just shielded itself in public. That is what most people are going to miss. They are going to watch a 24-hour reversal and treat it like indecision, like mixed signals, like chaos. It is not chaos. It is structure. It is what happens when one side tries to force a surrender from the outside while the other side has spent a decade building the capacity to refuse. That is why I said Iran was never going to give up Hormuz on America's terms. Not because Iran is stronger than the United States. It is not. Not because Tehran enjoys pain. It does not. And not because the pressure is fake. The pressure is real. I said it because the game itself was built in a way that made that outcome the most logical one on the board. If you want to understand what happened this morning, you have to stop looking at the strait as a daily headline and start looking at it as the one piece. On the board, neither side can afford to surrender. America says it wants the strait open, the war contained, and Iran forced into a settlement that removes the nuclear question and restores deterrence. That is the language. But underneath that language is something deeper. America wants to prove that it still controls the world's most important energy choke point. It wants every state watching this war to absorb the same lesson. When Washington decides a corridor matters, Washington can still decide what moves through it and on what terms. That message is not only for Tehran, it is for Beijing, it is for Moscow. It is for every government testing the edges of American power and wondering whether the old machinery still works. Iran's surface demands are different. Lift the pressure, unfreeze the money. Recognize sovereignty, include the wider region in any settlement, but Iran's real objective is even deeper than that. Iran wants Hormuz to become, in practice, a place where the world accepts that passage requires Iranian management, Iranian permission, Iranian weight in the equation. Not just during a war, not just during a crisis. Permanently enough that the strait itself becomes the thing that turns Iran from a sanctioned target into a strategic fact. That is a core conflict. America cannot prove uncontested control of Hormuz while Iran is demonstrating that the strait still bends around Iranian power. Iran cannot establish durable, practical authority over Hormuz while America is enforcing a blockade that treats Iranian control as illegitimate. There is no soft middle here, no elegant compromise hidden in the wording, no clever paragraph that makes both realities true at once. One side establishes the rule, or the rule remains contested. And states do not voluntarily surrender the one lever that makes them matter. That is the part Washington kept pretending it could bomb out of existence. It treated Hormuz as if it were simply a pressure point. Squeeze harder, and Tehran would eventually trade it away for relief. It treated relevance as negotiable. It treated strategic identity as if it were another asset on a sanctions list. But a state will endure extraordinary pain before it hands over. The one thing that makes stronger powers stop and calculate, that is game theory in its simplest form. Not what each side says, what each side cannot afford to lose. This morning proved it again, and yet that only gets you halfway through the story, because there is a second question that matters just as much. How did Iran retain the confidence to do this after everything it has absorbed? 50 days of pressure, heavy strikes, severe economic damage, internal warnings about long recovery timelines, real military degradation, real financial pain, real uncertainty, and still, Tehran moved back into the strait with a straight face and language hard enough to call the United States a pirate. That kind of confidence does not come from rhetoric alone. It comes from architecture. One word explains that architecture: China. Not China as a slogan, not China as a talking point. Not China as a simple ally standing beside Iran in some cartoon geopolitical frame. China as a system, China as a decade-long quiet construction project designed for exactly this kind of moment. That is the framework I want to give you, because without it, Iran's behavior looks emotional with it. Iran's behavior looks almost inevitable. Call it the decade of quiet. It began when the old nuclear framework broke and maximum pressure logic returned. At that point, China had to think about something larger than Iran itself. China's industrial economy runs on energy that still moves through maritime corridors the United States has historically dominated. A serious attempt by Washington to weaponize that geography was never just an Iranian problem. It was always a Chinese problem waiting for its moment. So Beijing did what Beijing does when it sees a structural vulnerability. It did not solve it loudly, it built around it quietly. First came the payment layer, Iranian oil bought in yuan instead of dollars. Transactions routed away from the dollar-centered system. America knows how to strangle. A sanctions architecture is only as effective as the channels it can actually touch. If the money never needs to move through the channels Washington controls, pressure does not disappear, but it stops being absolute. Then came the fleet layer, shadow shipping, ships going dark, flags that obscure rather than clarify ship. To ship transfers, cargoes relabeled after blending, oil that leaves one origin and arrives on paper as another. Official records saying one thing, physical barrels saying another. Entire chains designed not to look clean, but to stay moving. Then came the reserve layer. China spent years buying discounted oil and stacking strategic buffers. That matters because an energy shock only coerces if it arrives as a shock. If you built inventory before the crisis, you turn somebody else's emergency into your own calculation problem. You still pay a price. But price is not the same thing as strategic paralysis. Then came the intelligence and infrastructure layer, satellite support, monitoring, commercial, and dual. Use systems that sharpen targeting, awareness, and regional visibility. Engineering support that matters in the dull, untelevised parts of war. The rebuilding of capacity, the preservation of options, the quiet conversion of partnership into endurance, that is the decade of quiet, not one treaty, not one dramatic announcement, not one single gesture the world could point to and say, there it is, that is the moment everything changed. It changed rung by rung. And that is why this morning matters. Iran did not reassert itself in Hormuz from a position of fantasy. It did it from a structure built to make sure pressure produced pain without automatically producing collapse. That distinction is everything, because America's case is not nonsense. It is important to say that clearly. The pressure is real, the blockade is real, the damage is real. Iranian stress is real, financial deterioration is real, military depletion is real, diplomatic pressure through mediators is real. The gap between Iranian demands and American offers has narrowed at points. Movement has existed. The argument that sustained pressure can force hard outcomes is not delusional. History contains examples, but the American reading keeps making one analytical mistake. It confuses suffering with surrender. Those are not the same thing. Pain means the target is hurting. Collapse means the target has lost the ability to choose. China's quiet architecture did not remove Iran's pain. It widened the distance between pain and collapse. That distance is why Iran still has room to decide when to escalate, when to pause, when to bargain, when to reopen, and when to shut the door again. That distance is why a state under immense pressure can still act like it has agency. And once you understand that, this morning stops looking like a contradiction and starts looking like a signal. The signal is simple. Tehran is saying, we are still making choices. Now, the obvious question is, what comes next? There are really three paths from here, and this is where the story becomes a path tree rather than a headline. The first path is a deal before the clock runs out. Under this scenario, the pressure does finally cross the threshold. Tehran is willing to acknowledge money matters. Sanctions, relief matters. Frozen assets matter. The cost of extending the contest rises enough that Iran accepts a framework it can sell domestically, without looking like it surrendered the core of Hormuz. America declares success. Tehran declares sovereignty preserved. The wording does the diplomatic work. America calls it freedom of navigation. Iran calls it managed passage. The optics split. The practical reality lands somewhere in between. This is the least dramatic path, but it is not impossible. The reason it remains possible is that both sides still need a version of victory more than they need a perfect philosophical argument. If the terms are vague enough in public and precise enough in private, you can sometimes build an outcome neither side could have announced at the start. But even in that scenario, do not miss the deeper point. Iran would not be giving up Hormuz in substance, it would be trading language, timing, and optics, while trying to preserve practical relevance. That is why the structure still matters. The deal path only exists if Tehran can concede appearance while keeping enough of the lever to matter later. The second path is failure followed by renewed escalation, talk stall. The ceasefire window closes, America concludes that more pressure is the only remaining instrument, strikes resume. The next phase is supposed to be more decisive than the first, but here's the danger in that assumption. Second rounds are rarely just louder first rounds. By the time a first round ends, both sides have learned, damage has been measured, survival capacity has been tested, workarounds have been activated, tunnels cleared, stockpiles moved, routines adapted, weaknesses studied. If Tehran used a pause to recover even a portion of buried capability, then a resumed campaign is not simply pressure continued. It is a more expensive argument with fewer illusions left in it. That is why this path is more dangerous than many people think. It is not only the risk of more missiles or more strikes. It is the risk that the war enters a phase where each side is no longer trying to shock the other into changing course, but trying to prove the other cannot impose a finish. Those are the wars that get uglier than their architects planned. And if that happens, Hormuz does not stay a narrow shipping story. It expands, energy markets reprice. Again, regional states recalculate, insurance costs rise, diplomatic coalitions strain, financial consequences travel outward. The point is not just military escalation, the point is systemic escalation. The third path is the one I think Beijing finds most attractive. Not a clean treaty, not a dramatic signing ceremony, not a final peace. An extended ceasefire that slowly hardens into reality without anybody admitting that a new order has quietly been accepted. This is the path of managed ambiguity. China keeps pressing for stability without theatrics. Iran survives. Hormuz functions, but under a reality everyone understands, and no one describes the same way. America avoids the humiliation of openly backing down. Iran avoids the humiliation of openly giving in. China gets what it actually needs most: a living Iran, a functioning Strait, and a historical precedent that American coercion at the world's key choke point did not reach closure without Chinese weight in the equation. This path serves Beijing because it turns Chinese influence into the invisible hinge of the outcome. Not the hero of the story, the hinge that matters more. Because power is often more durable when it does not need applause. And if this is the path that emerges, the deeper lesson will be visible to every state watching. The issue was never only whether America could apply pressure. The issue was whether America could finish the game without the cooperation of the rival power that had spent a decade building ways around that pressure. That is why I keep coming back to the same line. The real story is not Hormuz opening and closing in 24 hours. The real story is that China spent a decade making sure Iran would still have choices when that hour came. Everything else follows from that. It explains why Tehran can speak in hard language after enormous damage. It explains why the Strait keeps returning as the center of gravity. It explains why the war keeps resisting simple endings. It explains why daily headlines keep looking like reversals when the underlying structure keeps staying the same. And it explains why the next phase of this crisis will not be decided by who sounds strongest on any given day, but by who built the deeper architecture before the crisis arrived. This is the mistake superficial analysis keeps making. It treats visible force as the whole story. But visible force is often only the top layer under it. Sit reserves, payment channels, supply lines, engineering capacity, intelligence links, diplomatic habits, shipping workarounds, and years of preparation nobody wanted to talk about when they were being built. That is the quiet part of power. And the quiet part is usually what decides whether loud power gets the result it wants. So yes, this morning matters. It matters because 5 vessels moved toward the Strait and turned around. It matters because one tanker went dark. It matters because Tehran used the language of piracy instead of pressure. It matters because what looked open yesterday no longer looked open today. But most of all, it matters because an entire hidden theory of the war just surfaced in plain sight. Iran did not prove that it is stronger than America. It proved something subtler and, for Washington, more uncomfortable. It proved that overwhelming strength is not the same thing as guaranteed conversion. It proved that you can dominate the sky, the sea, the sanctions regime, and the global headlines and still fail to force the exact political outcome you designed. If the other side spent long enough building a structure that lets it keep choosing. That is why I said Iran was never going to give up Hormuz on America's terms. Not because Tehran is fearless, not because the costs are fake, not because the pressure is not biting, But because the one thing a state almost never surrenders voluntarily is the lever that makes stronger states negotiate around it. Hormuz is that lever China understood that years ago. It built accordingly. And this morning, that hidden decade walked out into the sunlight. Now watch the next 72 hours carefully. Watch whether diplomacy produces language broad enough for both sides to lie to their own audiences and still live with the result. Watch whether military pressure resumes under the belief that more force can still solve what force has not yet solved. Watch whether China stays quiet, because in this story, quiet has often been the loudest signal of all. And ask the harder question that sits behind this entire crisis. If Beijing spent 10 years building the structure that made this moment possible, what other quiet structures are already in place for the next crisis? Before Washington even agrees that the game has changed, because the decade of quiet did not end when the war began. It only became visible. And that is the sentence I would leave you with. The fight over Hormuz was never about one day, opening, or one morning. Closure, it was about whether American pressure could force the surrender of a lever China had already spent a decade helping Iran preserve. Today, we got part of the answer, and the answer was no.